Welcome back. In this video, I'll be covering Learning Objective 9.2, describe how individuals perform differently when other people are around, for PSY 235 Social Psychology. In this part of the chapter, we're really going to explore how the mere presence of other people, when we become aware of them, when they're watching us, even if we think they're watching us and maybe they aren't actually watching us, but we think they might be, what kind of impact does that have on us? We're going to start by talking about a concept called social facilitation. And this is a really simple phenomenon, and I'm sure all of you have had the experience of it, but you may not have known what it was called. Social facilitation is the tendency for people to perform better on tasks that are simple and well learned, and worse on tasks that are complicated or new to us when they're in the presence of other people, and if their performance can actually be evaluated. So I included this picture of people running down the road because when I was an athlete running track, there were always I was a sprinter. I hated running distance, but our coaches always made us do it during preseason. So if I was ever out running on the road and I happened to see that there were people out in their front yards, I had a tendency to speed up and look very busy. If I was by myself, I would tend to run a bit slower. And that's a really simple social facilitation effect. There are some caveats, though. Notice how long this definition is. There are some key components involved in the social facilitation definition. There's task difficulty, but there's also the issue of people's performance being obvious, meaning how well they do. Before we get into the effects of those two different variables, let's talk about what the presence of other people means. So first, if you're performing a task with others who are doing the same thing, that's one way that people could be present. Another way is that you could be performing a task in front of an audience that isn't doing anything but watching you. So there are lots of ways in which, other people being in your presence can impact you. And it could be in terms of what are the other people doing. So in this picture, you have people jogging together. When people are performing a task like running that they know well and they know how to do, and it's not that hard a task, they do tend to push themselves harder when they're in a pack than when they are by themselves. Now, there's also tasks where you're just in front of an audience and they're not doing anything but observing you. And you may guess that maybe there are different effects there. So what has the research shown? Now, the study of social facilitation has, in my opinion, a very bizarre history. When I took my very first social psychology class as a student at Ohio Wesleyan, my teacher, my social psychology professor, told a story that I thought was just absolutely bonkers. And this image was something that he showed us, or a very similar one. And he said, when I was a graduate student, we did this research and it involved, of all things, cockroaches. Yes, the original social facilitation research involved not people, but bugs. And not just bugs, but bugs that we don't like very much at all. So what they did, and if you're familiar with cockroaches, they don't like light. They tend to run away from light. They scurry around and will run to dark places. So basically, the researchers designed these maze boxes, and the boxes had a floodlight at one end, and the little cockroach would be in the start box, and they would turn the floodlight on, and the cockroach would run from the start to the goal box because they run away from the light. Then there were these little boxes here. They're called audience boxes, and they're perforated. So cockroaches smell each other. I know it just gets grosser. because cockroaches, yuck. And they wanted to test the hypothesis with this simple maze. So you just have to go one direction, and you put the floodlight on, and they time how long does it take the little cockroach to get from the start box to the goal box. If they have other roaches, so these are not roaches who are running, they're just hanging out watching. If they have other roaches in the audience boxes, will the little roach run faster? Yes, he will. If you have no other roaches in the audience boxes, they will run slower. Now, you can also test your little roach in a more complicated maze. So they can either turn left, or they can go straight, or they can turn right. And what they have to figure out is which direction to turn. And if you put the audience members in the audience boxes, they actually struggle more with getting to the goal box than if there is no audience present. If you don't have other roaches watching you, you can figure out the puzzle faster. So basically, roaches aren't that different from people, which, ew. And basically, the way social facilitation lays out is you have other people, or cockroaches, present. They do represent distraction, whether you are a person or a cockroach. The distraction presented by other people can cause conflict for you, cognitively. The task itself can also be distracting. Now, in the simple task, whether you're a person or a cockroach, is simple. You just go from point A to point B to get away from the light. Here, with a complex task, though, the task itself becomes very, very distracting, and the presence of other people or roaches becomes very, very distracting, and that increases arousal. Performance will improve only if the task is simple and well learned. Performance will get worse if the task is hard. So let's look a little bit more at simple versus difficult tasks. If the task is pretty simple or is really, really well learned, the mere presence of other people tends to make us more aroused and makes us more energized, and that means we will perform better. In one of the very first experiments ever done, published, what Norman Triplett did was and this is why I have a picture of a fishing pole with a reel on it. He had kids line up, and he just asked them to wind the line on a fishing reel as fast as they could. And they either did it by themselves or in the presence of other kids. And when they did it in the presence of other kids, because it's a super simple task, all you have to do is turn the handle on the reel, they did it much faster than when they did it by themselves. So the presence of other children in that very simple task, it was arousing enough, meaning that it gave them energy that the kids wanted to perform better. And they may not have been fully aware that that's what was happening to them. The basic rule is that the arousal caused by the presence of other people, and by arousal I mean physiological, autonomic nervous system arousal, it's going to enhance whatever the dominant response is. So the presence of other people kind of makes our bodies more energized. You get, more adrenaline flowing, more of that I have to pay attention to these other people energy. And when such arousal exists, it's going to be easier to do something simple, but it's going to be much harder to do something new or complex. So the basic visual for this that you see here is if arousal is low and you're doing a difficult task, performance is going to peak somewhere in between no arousal and medium level arousal. and you're going to get your best performance when you've got that relatively low level of arousal. With easy tasks, having higher arousal can get you energized enough to perform even better than you would normally. So why does the presence of other people cause this kind of physiological response? We are designed, humans, we have evolved to be very social. So we tend to become very alert and very vigilant in the presence of other people. We want to know, are they friend or foe? Are they likely to be critical and judgmental of us, or are they likely to be accepting? Do they want something from us? Do they not? So we tend to become very alert and vigilant when other people are around. If we are performing a task, the presence of other people makes us very anxious or apprehensive about how we're being judged. So that's another reason that arousal comes from being around others. They also can be distracting. In some cases, if the task is hard or if just the pressure is really on, people can make mistakes in the presence of an audience, in the presence of other people. Now we're going to shift gears away from social facilitation, which is, the dominant response, either success or failure, is going to be maximized by the presence of other people when individual performance can be identified. In all of those social facilitation situations, your individual performance is clear. In social loafing, however, your individual input isn't clear. So I put the image here of a tug of war because you and your team are all holding on to the same rope. No one can really determine your individual contribution to pulling on the rope. It is entirely a group task. So what we're looking at here is when people are working on a communal task with each other and their individual efforts can't be singled out. That sets you up for a situation where people's effort, their energy, whether they know it or not, can be diminished. So in social facilitation, just to contrast here, the presence of other people actually puts all eyes on you. That makes you aroused. If you're embedded with other people, though, and you're merged into a group and it is a communal task, your individual contribution can't be singled out. That takes the pressure off. That means having other people around is going to actually make you more relaxed. And again, the difficulty of the task matters here. Let's pin down the definition of social loafing, and then we'll talk about how to compare social loafing and facilitation. Social loafing is the tendency for people to perform less well on easy tasks, but better on complicated ones when their individual performance can't be evaluated. So some of the early experiments on this actually did involve a type of tug of war, and you just have to use your imagination. I couldn't find any images of how this was done in the lab. But basically what they did was to take these cubicles, these very small rooms. And if you were the naive subject, you would come in, you'd sit down at a table, and in front of you would be a rope sticking out of a hole in the wall. And what you're told, and people will believe anything, you're told that you're just one of 6 other people who are going to be pulling on the rest of this rope. And you're given this, really vivid image by the experimenter. So they tell you a light is going to go off, and that will be your signal that everybody needs to pull on the rope. So if the participant is told that they're pulling with 5 other people or 6 other people on the rope, that's the only information they're given. They're told, pull as hard as you can. Versus a control group where the naive subject is brought in, they sit down and they say, here's a rope, pull as hard as you can when the light turns on. So you have solo versus group communal task. And what happens, pulling on a rope is super easy. people pull harder when they're alone than when they believe they are co-pulling with other people. The same thing happened when they did a similar design. They had the naive subject come in, sit down in front of a microphone, and they're told there are 6 other people in 6 other cubicles with 6 other microphones, and when the light goes off, you are to yell as loud as you can into the microphone. When people are alone and they're told they're alone, so in the control group, they're told there are no other people, just yell as loud as you can, they yell louder than when they are when they're operating under the belief that there are other people yelling at the same time. Now, both of those, pulling on a rope or yelling, are very simple tasks. If tasks are more difficult, you are less likely to have that kind of experience where you will lose, your performance will go down. If the task is complex and you are working in a group, the lessening of anxiety and arousal can actually allow each individual to perform better in that context. So they may put more energy into the task than they would have otherwise. So let's compare social facilitation and social loafing. And this is an image that comes from your text. So you have the presence of others. In social facilitation, individual efforts can be evaluated. In contrast, in social loafing, individual efforts can't be evaluated. In social facilitation, if you're being, you can be evaluated. Alertness and evaluation, apprehension, and distraction can represent conflict for you. That arousal, then, the impact of it is going to depend on whether the task is easy or difficult. You're going to have enhanced performance on simple tasks, impaired performance on complicated ones. In social loafing, and again, individual efforts can't be evaluated, you don't have that fear of evaluation apprehension because you're in a group, your contribution can't be singled out. That leads you to be relaxed, low arousal. On simple tasks, that means people will tend to put out less effort. On complicated tasks, it frees them up. The relaxation of being embedded in a group frees them up to perform better on those complex tasks. Now, sometimes students will ask me, well, what about group projects? Because students often have really negative attitudes about group projects because some people will underperform. They'll slack off because the other group members will pick up that slack. Now, typically when professors ask you to do group work, you will be able to tell who is working and who isn't working. That means it's not a true social loafing situation. It's a situation where you have individuals whose individual contributions can be detected and evaluated. So no, typical group work in educational contexts should have individually evaluated components to it. At least in the members of the group can tell who's contributing and who isn't. And that makes it not a true social loafing kind of situation. Now we're going to shift and look at how do other kinds of variables impact things like social loafing. And there's been a lot of research on this. It's in a fairly limited set of areas. So most of the research that we have is on gender and cross-cultural differences. Like there was some suggestion that you should be able to see differences between males and females in terms of the tendency towards social loafing. And in fact, researchers, now I will say that a lot of this research has been done in the past and hasn't been repeated, so it would be interesting to know whether the replications would hold. But in a lot of the research, what's been found is that for people, regardless of gender, who are high in a construct called relational interdependence, which in the United States, in a lot of cultures, particularly Western cultures, females do tend to score higher in relational interdependence than males, mostly because of the way gender roles are constructed. So the tendency is to focus more on personal relationships with individuals and maintaining the importance of those relationships. So that has been used to explain these differences. We have tended to find that there's a stronger tendency towards social loafing in males than females, but it's largely unconscious. People don't know that they're doing it. So this isn't like slacking in your group assignments, where you have that one member of the group who you just want to strangle on a regular basis because they're just not putting in any effort. It's not like that. It's more like the way in which people's unconscious contributions to the group tend to play out. We also find that the tendency to socially loaf is stronger in Western cultures than in Asian ones. Now, remember, I've said this a lot in my lectures up to this point. When we say Asian cultures, most of the research has been done in Japan and China. A little has been done in India and Pakistan. So social loafing tendencies do tend to be a bit stronger in Western cultures. Like the gender-based research, the explanation has more to do with cultural values and social norms. So the assumption is that for people from Asian cultures, where there is a stronger sense of interdependence, the tendency towards social loafing should be reduced because people have an overriding concern about the performance of the group itself. Similar to the gender-based differences, if you are high in relational interdependence, you care a lot how the group performs. And that will override that tendency to loaf. Same appears to be the case when we're comparing broadly Western cultures like the United States, Western and Northern Europe, and Canada. You shouldn't exaggerate these findings, though. As we've seen in a lot of areas in social psychology, replications of these findings are tricky. The tasks have to be very, very carefully constructed, such that it is impossible to identify individual contributions without these really ridiculous manipulations. So don't take them very far. You should not assume that all men are slackers and all women are all in on all tasks. That's simply an exaggeration that the data doesn't warrant. Same goes for cross-cultural differences. There are loads of individual differences that come into play in all of these situations. So what are some things that you can do to reduce social loafing tendencies? If you have relatively simple problems, you can insert some evaluation apprehension. If you are a teacher and you have a group project, make sure that individual contributions to the task can actually be identified. And that can go a long way to reducing social loafing. Not allowing people to hide their inputs can actually just circumvent the social loafing tendencies altogether, especially if you're talking about straightforward tasks that can be interfered with a lot when people's performance kind of gets suppressed. If the task is difficult or complicated, then, reductions in evaluation apprehension by putting people into groups can actually help them perform better. Taking away the individual contributions. So you really have to pay attention to that intersection between task difficulty and evaluation apprehension. Sorry, my brain just sort of shut down for a second there. If the task is hard, taking down the evaluation apprehension can actually improve group performance. If the task is straightforward and fairly simple, you need to add some evaluation apprehension by identifying individual contributions in order to preserve high performance. Now, one aspect of why social loafing happens is something called de-individuation. when we are embedded in groups, we are, in fact, in some ways, de-individuated. So looking at the concept of de-individuation more broadly outside of the social loafing context, de-individuation happens when we are embedded in crowds, or at the very least large groups, that can kind of free us up from the usual kinds of norms and restrictions on our behavior. And this kind of effect is really ramped up when we can't be identified individually. So, for example, we are in spooky season. It is October. When I was a kid, and this is very, very different now, I grew up rural. We were out in the country. So Halloween was super fun because our parents would kind of collect us out, from the township outside of the town where our school was. We'd all put on all of our costumes and our masks, and they would drop us off at one end of the town, and then they would go to a diner and have dinner with all their friends. And we were just to make our way from one end of the town to the other, collecting candy. We were all in costume. So much mischief happened. So much nonsense happened during those escapades. There's also, from my days in college, as a college student, I really felt that it was my civic duty to march on Washington at least once. So when I was in college, the issues had to do with Central America and our disagreement with some of the policies of the federal government in Central America at that time. It doesn't really matter what the issues were. We got on buses and we went and marched. Same thing happened, during the Women's March, right after the election of Donald Trump the first time around. When you're embedded in a great big crowd like that, some of the normal kind of restrictions on your individual behavior just sort of fall away. When I marched on Washington the first time that I went, we were actually in a situation, we were marching past the House, Congress, and there were some lawmakers kind of out and about, and we just started cursing at them. Under normal circumstances, I'm not going to curse at an elected official if they know who I am, but they didn't know who I was from anyone. We were all dressed alike. We weren't wearing masks or anything, but we were indistinguishable from one another. And that just made it super easy to be rude. Or think about times when you've been in at a sporting event or at a concert. You can't be really identified. You're just one in the crowd. You feel confident you can do pretty much anything when you're de-individuated. Sometimes that's for good. Sometimes it's not. De-individuation can get us into trouble because we often feel less accountable for what we're doing. Like we can get away with things when we're embedded in a crowd and we can't be identified and blamed, essentially. So this is why we felt like, yeah, we can curse out members of Congress if we feel like it, because who's going to catch us? And we want to make us stink anyway. We want to make a statement. Becoming de-individuated can increase the degree to which you're going to follow the crowd that you're in. So whatever norms they set up. Like I was at a Cleveland baseball game many years ago, and we were sitting in, kind of nosebleedy seats. And I can't remember the exact context, but I think there was a player that had been traded from Cleveland to Chicago, and people were really angry about the trade. They thought the player was at fault for not staying in Cleveland. And this player was an outfielder. And in my section in the crowd, they were shouting the rudest, coldest, meanest, most disgusting things at this person who used to be on the Cleveland baseball team. And I'm sitting back going, wow, this is a seriously really ugly de-individuation context. Because, under normal circumstances, if they ran into this guy on the street, they're not going to say a word to him. but they're in a crowd and the group norm is to be abusive to this person, people are likely to obey those group norms. Now, de-individuation doesn't always lead to bad things. Sometimes it leads to not so bad things. It can, if the group norm is to behave nicely, good things will happen. Like when I was on the Women's March, it was shoulder to shoulder, jam-packed people. You couldn't move 2 inches without bumping into another person. It was thousands and thousands of people. One of the group norms that emerged, even in this de-individuated state, was that you had a responsibility to take care of the other people around you. It was actually a relatively quiet environment. I remember distinctly at one point there was a group, and one member of the group was using a walker. It was an older lady, and she was surrounded by other people. And the group norm was you protect each other at all costs, because there were some fears going into the march that there was going to be agitators from the outside. And what happened at one point, there were some counter protesters and they were shouting, and you could just see the group surrounded this older lady and insulated her from all things. She had like this impenetrable boundary of women surrounding her. So de-individuation doesn't always lead to bad things, but it can. And that's probably the examples you're most familiar with. It really just depends on what the norm of the group is. There are lots of variables that contribute to de-individuation. I found this image on Google Images. It's messy, and that's how de-individuation works. De-individuation is kind of maximized by something called diffused responsibility. So your individual responsibility is depleted when you're in that kind of situation. But what factors into diffused responsibility? All these other things. Arousal by being in a group. Like when we were marching on Washington and we started, the group started cursing at all of the House members, it was exciting. It was very socially arousing. The group was very large and right next to you. You couldn't escape them. It would be kind of obvious if you weren't participating. There's also physical anonymity. The more people look like one another, or if they are wearing disguise, all of that can diffuse responsibility. It makes you less identifiable, and it can increase de-individuation. Once de-individuation is present, it can increase your vulnerability to responding to social cues that are around you, to situational cues, and it can cause you to just lose sight of the things that would normally control your behavior, like your inner values and beliefs and ideals. In this period of time where we're online a lot of our lives, especially since the onset of social media, we've started to see a lot of de-individuation in that online environment. It's very easy sitting on your phone or in front of your computer screen to feel and in fact be anonymous. Many people intentionally hide their identity online, whether they're on dating sites or on social media sites or on gaming sites. Sometimes people adopt avatars that are not connected to their names. And in those situations, you can create de-individuation that permits you to behave in ways that you might otherwise not behave. Even when your name is present and you are identifiable, there's something really compelling about that online space that makes you feel de-individuated because you are not physically in the presence of other people. I'm sure this is not news to you. You know that people often say and do things online that they would never say if they were face to face with another human being. At the same time, there are ways in which internet communications, whether you're in online forums, open discussions, being somewhat de-individuated can open that free and open discourse. At other times, though, it can become a cesspool, and I'm sure that you're well aware of those differences. What can happen if we have these de-individuated state kind of contexts online, we can see loss of civility. And again, I'm sure you have seen this. I certainly see it every single day. When I'm on TikTok or I'm on Instagram or I'm on Facebook, it is very, very easy to identify situations where civility just goes out the window and people say very cold, very rude things because they are de-individuated. They can't be identified and they feel very distant from other people. That concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 9.2.